In the psychology department of Cornell University, beneath the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, rests a relic of American evil sealed in glass. Suspended in a jar of cloudy formaldehyde is a brain, heavy, gray, and disturbingly intact. Its weight, precisely 1,673 cubic centimeters, makes it one of the largest on record. It belonged to a man who could speak 8 languages, translate Greek poetry with ease, and theorize about the origins of human speech in ways that captivated scholars of his time. Yet behind that brilliance was a calculating murderer whose intellect became the instrument of his own damnation. That brain once belonged to Edward Howard Rulloff, the teacher, the doctor, the philologist, the killer. For generations, professors and criminologists have stared into that jar, searching for answers that never come. How could a mind so vast become a vessel for such cruelty? How could genius and savagery exist in the same skull? What happens when intellect loses its conscience? To understand that, we must return to a time when New York's hills were young, when steam power and scripture carried equal weight, and when the pursuit of knowledge could become a doorway to darkness. The year was 1842. The Erie Canal had transformed New York's interior from quiet farmland into a corridor of ambition. The Second Great Awakening had swept through its towns, stirring revivalist passion and reformist zeal. Progress was no longer confined to the cities. Small communities now competed for culture, for learning, for refinement. To them, educated men were more than teachers. They were symbols of divine promise, proof that even the smallest town could breed greatness. Into this rising hope came a man who seemed destined to fulfill it, a stranger who introduced himself as Edward Rulloff, a scholar from the north, learned and worldly, with manners that suggested better breeding than the coarse canal workers and weathered farmers around him. When he arrived in the village of Dryden, near Ithaca, people felt as if Providence itself had sent them a gift. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the assurance of a man who had never been denied respect. His hair was jet black, his eyes sharp and uncomfortably penetrating, the kind of gaze that lingered too long, as if he were studying not the face before him but the soul behind it. When he spoke, his words rolled in measured cadence, the diction of someone accustomed to lecturing rather than conversing. To those who met him, he seemed impossibly intelligent, almost superhuman. He could recite Virgil in Latin, analyze herbs with a surgeon's precision, and quote Kant and Goethe with equal ease. Within weeks, he was giving public lectures on phrenology, the pseudoscience that claimed character could be read through the shape of the skull. Villagers gathered in packed halls to watch him trace the ridges of a volunteer's head with delicate fingers, describing their virtues and flaws with eerie accuracy. He seemed to see things others couldn't, and they loved him for it. In an age that worshipped intellect, Rulloff was divine. But there were cracks beneath the polish. No one knew that the man now dazzling Dryden had once been an inmate. He had been born not in New York but across the border in St. John, New Brunswick, around 1820. His real name was John Edward Howard Rulloffson, the son of a Danish immigrant who served briefly as a justice of the peace. When his father died, the family fortune collapsed, leaving young Edward with nothing but his books and a burning conviction that he was meant for greater things. He was the kind of child teachers remembered, a voracious reader, astonishingly precocious, capable of devouring entire volumes of natural philosophy in a sitting. But his brilliance came with arrogance, and his arrogance with deceit. By 16, he was suspected of setting fires to conceal thefts from the store where he worked. When stolen goods were found in his possession, he was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to prison. There, surrounded by thieves and arsonists, he didn't repent, he evolved. The experience hardened him, taught him how to mimic respectability, how to lie without blinking, and how to study people as he once studied books. When he was released, he crossed into the United States under a new name, Edward Rulloff, a man reborn not as a reformed sinner, but as something colder, a predator wearing the mask of genius. In Dryden, that mask worked perfectly. He found employment as a clerk in the town's apothecary, mixing tinctures and advising farmers on herbal remedies. His grasp of medicine seemed uncanny. He spoke of botany, chemistry, and the human body with the confidence of a university-trained physician. When someone mentioned a fever or infection, he'd describe the cause and cure as though nature herself had whispered it to him. People began to call him Dr. Rulloff, and he did nothing to correct them. He became a fixture of the town's intellectual life, the kind of man who could host discussions on philosophy one evening and mend a sprained wrist the next. The more he was admired, the more he fed on that admiration, treating it like sustenance. He was not content with acceptance, he wanted reverence, and he nearly achieved it. Within a year, Dryden's school board invited him to become headmaster of the local academy. The position granted him not only prestige but access to families, influence, and the admiration of young minds. Among his pupils was a 17-year-old girl named Harriet Schutt, daughter of one of the area's most respected farming families. Harriet was everything the town cherished: graceful, educated, gentle, and kind. She had soft brown hair that glinted gold in the afternoon light, and eyes of such clarity that people often said you could see the best of her soul in them. To her family, she was a treasure. To Edward, she was something far more dangerous, an object of possession. No one knows when his obsession began, only that it grew with every lesson, every shared word, every passing glance. He spoke to her of philosophy and poetry, of science and destiny. In a world where women were rarely encouraged to think beyond the domestic, his intellect must have seemed intoxicating. For Harriet, he was the doorway to a life of meaning. For him, she was proof that he could command beauty and virtue as easily as knowledge. Their romance unfolded in the quiet corners of the schoolyard, in the respectful exchanges of letters, and beneath the approving eyes of a community convinced they were witnessing the birth of an ideal marriage. But even then there were whispers, moments when Edward's mask slipped, revealing a possessiveness that went beyond love. He hated to see other men speak to her. He bristled when she laughed too freely. When a local merchant complimented her handwriting, Edward's smile froze, and his knuckles whitened against his glass of cider. His temper, when roused, was volcanic, and though he would apologize afterward with disarming gentleness, the rage always returned, hotter, faster, more unpredictable. Still, Harriet believed in him. In a society where women were taught to be loyal above all else, she saw his intensity as passion, his jealousy as devotion. Her parents, cautious but polite, found him impressive if a bit severe. Her father admired his intellect, but worried about his pride. Her mother sensed something colder beneath his charm, but couldn't name it. When the couple announced their engagement, the family hesitated, but the community rejoiced. On December 31st, 1843, under a pale sky heavy with snow, Edward Rulloff and Harriet Schutt were married in a modest ceremony at her family's farmhouse. The guests described it as elegant, though not lavish, the kind of union that brought pride to a town hungry for stories of upward mobility. Yet even that day, something dark revealed itself. As the ceremony concluded, the minister leaned forward as custom allowed to bless the bride with a brief kiss on the cheek. In that instant, Edward's face changed. The smile vanished. His eyes narrowed with such venom that guests instinctively drew back. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to freeze. Then, just as quickly, his expression softened again, replaced by the courteous composure of a gentleman. The incident was whispered about afterward but dismissed, perhaps nerves or shyness or simple possessiveness. But to Harriet, the look in his eyes that moment felt like a glimpse into something monstrous. They began married life in Lansing, a few miles away, in a small white house near the lake. To the townspeople it seemed idyllic, the learned physician and his radiant young wife beginning a future together. Edward opened a small practice in botanical medicine, treating local farmers with mixtures of herbs and tinctures that often worked better than conventional remedies. He was attentive, polite, and generous, charging little, sometimes nothing at all. People trusted him. They came to him with ailments of the body, never suspecting the sickness festering in his mind. Inside the home, the truth was far different. His temper returned in flashes of cruelty. He controlled Harriet's every movement, questioning her endlessly, forbidding her from visiting family without him. When she laughed, he demanded to know why. When she cried, he accused her of manipulation, the walls of their home. And then, in April 1845, their daughter was born. They named her Priscilla, a delicate infant with her mother's features and her father's dark eyes. For a time, Edward seemed transformed. He read poetry to the child, described the world as if educating a future philosopher. He spoke of moving west, to Ohio perhaps, to take a position at a college. He dreamed aloud of recognition, of a future where his brilliance would finally be rewarded. Harriet wanted to believe him. For a fleeting few months it seemed possible. But peace does not survive in a house built on fear. Edward's paranoia returned, this time directed at a new target, Dr. Henry Bull, his business partner and Harriet's cousin. Bull was a real physician, kind and well-liked, whose casual affection for his cousin, an occasional kiss on the cheek, a laugh shared over supper, was entirely innocent. But to Edward it was betrayal. He became convinced they were lovers, that the entire Schutt family was conspiring to humiliate him. His rage grew until it poisoned every breath of their home. Then came the deaths. Harriet's sister-in-law fell ill after childbirth, and Edward, eager to prove his skill, prepared herbal remedies for both her and the infant. Within days, both were dead. At the funeral, he showed no grief, only irritation that people were whispering. When Harriet's mother wept, he muttered that she might be next. The words hung in the air like frost. The family's love curdled into suspicion. They stopped visiting. Rumors spread quietly that the brilliant doctor had poisoned his own kin. Harriet begged him to leave to start anew somewhere far away, but he refused to go alone. He wanted her entirely or not at all, and so the arguments began, louder, crueler, endless. He accused her of infidelity, of deceit, of being turned against him by her family. She tried to reason with him, but reason had long since been replaced by obsession. Then, on a stormy night in June 1844, lightning flickering over Cayuga Lake, everything came undone. Harriet stood in the kitchen, grinding peppercorns in a heavy iron pestle. Edward's voice rose behind her, venomous and slurred from drink. His accusations tumbled over each other, lies, betrayal, humiliation. She turned weary and laughed. That sound, the soft, exhausted laugh of a woman who'd had enough, ignited the final spark in him. What happened next would mark the birth of one of America's darkest legends. The sound of Harriet's laughter, soft, almost dismissive, cut through the room like glass through silk. For Edward Rulloff, it was unbearable. That sound was mockery. It was every humiliation he had imagined, every slight his delusions had twisted into proof of betrayal. His pulse thundered in his skull, his eyes fixed on the pestle in her hand, the object she had used to prepare dinner, the same hand that had once held their infant daughter with such tenderness. He reached for it, a blur of motion, and the iron met flesh with a sound that silenced the storm outside. The blow landed square on Harriet's forehead, splitting skin, bone, and light itself. She collapsed instantly, the pestle rolling from her hand, a dark ribbon of blood spreading across the kitchen floor. The thunder that had rumbled moments earlier now seemed distant, as if the world itself recoiled from what it had just witnessed. Edward stood over her, his breath heavy, his hands shaking but his mind already cold and calculating. The rage that had driven the act vanished as swiftly as it had come. In its place came an eerie clarity, a strange, dispassionate curiosity. He watched her chest rise and fall, slower, weaker, until it stopped entirely. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came the sound of their infant daughter crying from her cradle in the next room, a thin, desperate wail that pierced through the haze of death and rage. He turned his head toward it, and in that moment, another thought entered his mind. Cruel, methodical, and utterly insane. That child with her mother's eyes would someday grow, would remember this house, would speak of what had happened. The same brilliance that had once allowed him to construct theories of language now twisted itself into a monstrous logic. He could not be discovered. He could not risk being undone by his own blood. He crossed the room, still breathing hard, and prepared a narcotic from his shelf of botanical extracts, an infusion of nightshade and laudanum. He moved with the calm precision of a physician administering a cure. Perhaps in his own warped reasoning, he thought he was sparing her a life of sorrow. He touched the small spoon to her lips. The crying stopped. The house fell still again. 2 lives extinguished within an hour. A wife, a child, a legacy of love turned into evidence of murder. By morning, the storm had passed. The lake outside shimmered under grey light. Edward Rulloff opened the curtains and stared out across the water. His reflection in the glass stared back, a man of learning, poised, untouchable. To anyone looking in from the street, he was simply awake early, preparing for the day. But in his mind, something irreversible had snapped. He wrapped Harriet's body carefully in sheets, the same ones they had shared their bed upon, and placed them into a wooden chest. He did the same with the small form of Priscilla. He packed the chest with stones from the garden, then dragged it through the damp morning air toward the wagon he had borrowed from a neighbor. When he heaved it aboard, his breath came in short bursts. The wheels sank slightly into the mud as he steered the cart toward Cayuga Lake. It was early enough that no one saw him. The fog hung thick over the water as he pushed the heavy chest from the wagon into a small rowboat. The oars groaned as he rowed toward the lake's center, every stroke a slow erasure of guilt. When he reached a point where the shore was barely visible, he stopped. The water below was black and bottomless. He looked down into it for a long moment. Perhaps he saw his reflection there too, rippling, broken by the movement of the boat. Then, with one motion, he tipped the chest into the water. It sank slowly, bubbles rising, spreading outward like the last breaths of the dead. He watched until the ripples faded, until the lake looked as calm and lifeless as the expression on his own face. When he returned home, he began his performance. He told neighbors that Harriet had taken the baby to visit relatives near Erie, Pennsylvania. Later, the story changed. They were in Madison, Ohio. Then he said they'd gone to stay by the Seneca Lakes for her health. His explanations were smooth, eloquent, and utterly false. But Dryden was a small town. People noticed details: the unfinished meal left on the table, the baby's blanket folded neatly by the cradle, Harriet's traveling basket still on her dresser, her jewelry untouched, her letters unanswered. At first, the neighbors whispered. Then they questioned. Finally, they confronted. Edward smiled through it all, maintaining the poise of a scholar misunderstood by lesser minds. He wrote a letter to himself and claimed it was from Harriet, a desperate attempt to lend authenticity to his lie. It fooled no one. Weeks passed. The silence around the Schutt family deepened into grief. Harriet's brothers, William and Ephraim, refused to believe she had gone willingly. They searched the countryside, questioned everyone who had seen Edward in the days after her disappearance. A farmer recalled seeing him hauling a large chest toward the lake early one morning. Another mentioned that his demeanor had been strangely calm, detached, as if relieved of some burden. When Ephraim pressed him for answers, Edward turned the conversation into philosophy, fate, free will, the tragedy of human misunderstanding. His arrogance only deepened suspicion. Then, one night, he vanished. He left behind unpaid bills, uncollected medicines, and a town certain that it had been living beside a murderer. Ephraim Schutt's grief hardened into determination. He saddled his horse and began what became one of the earliest manhunts in New York's history. From Lansing to Rochester, from train stations to riverboats, he chased the man who had stolen his sister's life. He found him at last in Rochester, standing among travelers at a busy station, preparing to board a train west. When their eyes met, Edward smiled, serene, unafraid. He spoke of coincidence, of fate, insisting that Ephraim join him to see that Harriet was alive and well in Ohio, against every instinct. Ephraim agreed, driven by one last hope that perhaps his suspicions were wrong. They traveled together, side by side in tense silence. Edward maintained the composure of a scholar, discussing literature and the virtues of patience, while his companions stared at him in quiet fury. At every stop, Edward seemed to delay, watching crowds, studying exits. In Buffalo, Ephraim finally understood the deception. The moment they reached the docks to board a steamboat, Edward disappeared. One instant he was walking ahead through the crowd, the next he was gone. Swallowed by the movement of passengers and smoke, Ephraim searched frantically but found nothing. The steamboat departed without him, its paddle wheel carving the grey water. He knew then that his sister was dead. Back in Lansing, the search for bodies began. Dozens of men combed the shores of Cayuga Lake, dragging nets and grappling hooks through its dark water. They found nothing. The lake kept its secrets well. It was deep, 400 feet in places, and cold enough to preserve the dead indefinitely. The lack of bodies made conviction impossible, but public opinion had rendered its own verdict. Edward Rulloff, the learned doctor, the charming scholar, he did not go far. In Pennsylvania he began again. This time he called himself James Nelson, a scholar of languages and aspiring inventor. The same charm that had seduced Dryden worked once more. He gained employment, friendship, even admiration. He courted business partners, delivered lectures, and spun stories about his research. One man he befriended offered him partnership in an enterprise manufacturing industrial tools. Another arranged introductions to faculty at Jefferson College, where Rulloff, under his new name, was considered for a professorship. He might have succeeded again had his past not followed him like a shadow. A letter arrived from an old acquaintance in Ithaca mentioning that his name had been cleared, that he could return home if he wished. But there was no clearing to be done, and Edward knew it. He read the letter and realized it meant only one thing: the law was closing in. Within weeks, authorities arrested him on charges of kidnapping his wife, a lesser crime, but one that kept him from the gallows. The trial was a spectacle. He refused counsel, defending himself with poise and precision that astonished the courtroom. He argued not as a criminal pleading for mercy, but as an intellectual dissecting the flaws of his accusers. His eloquence almost worked. Jurors listened with admiration to the man they were meant to condemn, yet the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Found guilty, he was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor, but even in prison he remained extraordinary. Where others broke, he thrived. He studied obsessively, turning his cell into a miniature academy. Guards brought him books. Reformers brought visitors. He lectured on philology, on the roots of language, on the mysterious origins of communication itself. He spoke with such conviction that many believed he was misunderstood, perhaps even innocent. He began to write his life's work, a manuscript he called Method in the Formation of Language. He believed it would revolutionize human understanding, that it would outlive him, make him immortal in the halls of academia. He became a symbol of the reformed intellect, the criminal mind redeemed by study. But the truth was simpler. Prison had not cured him. It had refined him. His brilliance had become colder, his ego sharper. Behind the gentle lectures and Latin recitations, he was planning, calculating, waiting. Among his students was a young man named Albert Jarvis, the son of the local undersheriff. Barely out of his teens, Albert admired the imprisoned scholar, spending hours studying Greek under his guidance. Rulloff saw in him something he could use, a mind eager to serve, a heart easy to manipulate. The friendship grew into devotion, and devotion into loyalty. When his sentence ended in 1856, Rulloff walked out of prison with plans already forming. The law tried to rearrest him for murder, but he argued double jeopardy, that he could not be tried twice for the same crime. The prosecutor, unwilling to risk a legal failure, shifted the charge from the murder of Harriet to that of infant Priscilla. Once more, Rulloff defended himself. Once more, the jury condemned him. This time he was sentenced to die, but the scholar still had one lesson left to teach. Awaiting execution in the Ithaca jail, he escaped. One night, the cell stood empty, the door unforced, the locks intact. Only one conclusion fit: someone inside had helped him. The undersheriff's son, his former student, was missing the next day. Edward Rulloff, the murderer, the linguist, the genius, had vanished again into the world. When Edward Rulloff disappeared from the Ithaca jail, the people of upstate New York awoke to the chilling realization that a condemned killer had vanished without a trace. There were no broken locks, no signs of struggle, only the empty cell and the faint scent of candle smoke. The townspeople whispered of black magic, of Satan's hand guiding his chosen disciple. Others said he had bribed his way out, but the truth was far more mundane and far more terrifying. He had charmed his way free. Albert Jarvis, the under-sheriff's son who had studied under Rulloff, had fallen completely under the murderer's spell. The young man who once believed he was learning Latin and philosophy had, without realizing it, been apprenticed in deceit. He knew the jail's routines, the guards' habits, the soft spots in the system. One night he used that knowledge to free his teacher. By dawn, both men were gone, leaving behind an open cell and a legacy of humiliation for local law enforcement. For months afterward, the state scoured the countryside. Rewards were offered, and detectives followed every rumor, from the docks of Buffalo to the border towns of Pennsylvania. But Rulloff was no longer the desperate fugitive of his first escape. He had evolved again. His mind, disciplined by a decade of reading and planning, made him a master of disguise and deception. He changed his name as easily as changing clothes. Dr. Nelson in one town, Professor Williams in another, even Reverend Harris in the small villages that trusted piety more than proof. Wherever he went, he found admirers. He had learned how to play the part of a scholar so convincingly that no one questioned his past. He lectured on science, taught languages, mended books, and repaired watches. He lived on the fringes of respectability, close enough to touch it, far enough to elude it. But beneath the surface, his old arrogance grew into something darker. He began stealing again. Small at first, books from libraries, gold watches from his pupils, rare instruments from apothecaries. Then larger, more daring schemes. He realized that his intelligence could serve crime as easily as academia. While ordinary thieves relied on brute force, Rulloff used strategy. He planned burglaries like scientific experiments, studying patterns, noting habits, calculating the odds of success with mathematic precision. And as his intellect drove him deeper into crime, he drew others into his orbit, men who saw in him a strange authority. A kind of criminal philosopher who could make sin sound like science. One of them was William Dexter, a hardened burglar who admired the older man's composure. Together with the still loyal Jarvis, they formed a trio that would become infamous across the Northeast. They robbed warehouses and shops, specializing in high-value goods, fine silks, jewelry, imported fabrics, anything easy to move and hard to trace. Rulloff insisted on meticulous planning, detailed sketches of buildings, schedules of guards, lists of escape routes. Every job was treated like a thesis, every theft a demonstration of intellect over law. He rarely committed the act himself. His genius lay in orchestration. During the day, he was a mild, articulate gentleman, still pursuing his linguistic theories. At night, he became the architect of elegant crimes. The contradiction pleased him. To deceive others was proof of superiority. To deceive the law was triumph. In Brooklyn, he found the anonymity he needed to thrive. The city's noise and bustle allowed him to disappear among thousands. There, he set up what appeared to be a modest workshop and study, filled with papers, maps, and books on comparative grammar. Neighbors saw a quiet scholar at work, unaware that beneath his desk were stolen goods and coded notes describing burglaries across 3 states. But even as he succeeded in his secret life, something restless stirred inside him. The same hunger for recognition that had driven him as a young teacher began to re-emerge. His criminal victories, however profitable, felt hollow compared to the immortality he had once envisioned through his scholarship. He still believed that method in the formation of language, his great unfinished manuscript, would change the world. He revised it between robberies, filling its pages with sweeping theories that mixed linguistic science with wild speculation about human origins. He believed that language itself was divine proof of reason, that he alone had decoded its hidden architecture. To anyone else, the manuscript was a tangled web of genius and madness, brilliant observations buried beneath narcissistic flourishes. To Rulloff, it was scripture. In 1869, word reached him that the newly formed American Philological Association would be holding its first convention in Poughkeepsie. It was, he believed, his chance to re-enter the world that had rejected him. He would present his theories, reclaim his name, and prove to the scholars who dismissed him that the criminal they'd condemned was, in truth, a visionary. He revised the manuscript obsessively, every page written in his tight, elegant hand. When he finished, he believed he held the key to human understanding. He wrote to the association under the name Professor Luriot, offering to sell his work for the astonishing sum of $500,000, a figure so audacious it made editors laugh aloud. But Rulloff wasn't joking. In his delusion, the value of his genius was beyond price. The scholars ignored him. His manuscript was rejected without ceremony. The silence that followed was unbearable. For the second time in his life, the world had refused to acknowledge his brilliance, and that refusal transformed him once more. The arrogance that had once fueled his ambition turned to resentment. If society would not honor him as a scholar, it would fear him as a force of nature. The rejection became his justification, his fuel. He told himself that theft, deceit, even violence were merely the tools of a man too advanced for his age. A misunderstood intellect reclaiming what the world had denied him. By the winter of 1869, his gang was planning their most ambitious crime yet. It was Jarvis who brought him the opportunity. In the growing town of Binghamton, the Halbert Brothers dry goods store had recently received a shipment of silks worth a small fortune. The goods were locked. The building's back entrance faced the Chenango River, offering multiple escape routes. It was perfect. They studied the site for weeks. Jarvis, meticulous as always, observed the clerks' habits, the times they doused the lamps, when they rose for water, the rhythm of their nights. Dexter, the muscle of the trio, secured tools and chloroform to subdue them without bloodshed. And Rulloff, as always, directed from above. Every movement calculated, every second accounted for. He treated it like an experiment in human control. But arrogance blinds even the brilliant. The night of August 17, 1870, was heavy with summer heat, the kind that clings to the skin and thickens the air. The three men moved through the shadows behind the store, their footsteps muffled by layers of cloth wrapped around their shoes. The plan was simple: break in through the basement, release the chloroform to knock out the clerks, and carry away the silks before dawn. Inside, the air was thick and stale. They lit a small lantern and began their work. But the darkness hit a fatal obstacle. As they crept toward the staircase, Jarvis stumbled. His boot caught a crate, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound rang out like a pistol shot. Upstairs, the Clarks, Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, woke instantly. They were young, strong, and terrified, but not foolish. Merrick reached for the pistol he kept beneath his pillow and sprang to his feet. The room filled with the sound of movement, confusion, and shouts. In the chaos, Rulloff's carefully woven plan unraveled. The burglars had not expected resistance. Merrick's pistol misfired with a hollow click, but he didn't hesitate. He swung a heavy stool at the intruders, striking Dexter and knocking him back. Burroughs lunged at Jarvis, and the two crashed against the wall, locked in a violent struggle. For a brief moment, the young Clarks seemed to be winning. The intruders were disoriented, trapped in a room too small for escape. Then Rulloff's calm voice cut through the noise. He pulled his revolver and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The blast froze everyone. Smoke filled the room. He ordered them to yield. Merrick refused. He threw himself at Jarvis again, his courage burning brighter than fear. Rulloff fired once more. This time, the bullet struck Merrick in the head. The young man fell instantly, lifeless, his blood spreading across the wooden floor. For a moment, no one moved. The reality of the act, the final, irreversible crossing of a line, hung in the air like smoke. Rulloff's face remained expressionless. To him, it was not murder. It was consequence. He had defended the plan, maintained order, preserved control. But the sound of that shot had shattered something that no intellect could repair. Burroughs fled, screaming into the night, his voice echoing through the empty streets of Binghamton. The cry carried, waking neighbors and drawing lawmen from their beds. Rulloff, Jarvis, and Dexter bolted for the river, desperate to vanish before dawn. They reached the water's edge, breathless, their hands trembling. The current was faster than it looked, the moonlight dancing on its restless surface. Jarvis, wounded and weak, insisted they could wade across. He stepped first. The river swallowed him almost immediately. Dexter followed, struggling against the pull, and vanished beneath the churning water. Rulloff alone reached the far shore, drenched and gasping, the weight of his own survival pressing down on him like the stones he had once tied to Harriet's chest. He turned back toward the river, hearing only silence. The men who had served him, trusted him, believed in his genius, were gone. Behind him, the town was awakening. Torches flickered along the streets, dogs barked, and the echo of shouts rolled down the riverbanks. The chase had begun. He stumbled through fields toward the railway line, his mind racing faster than his feet. Every sound became an alarm, every shadow a pursuer. He made it as far as the station before dawn. When an officer approached, asking his name, he panicked. Instead of answering, he ran. That single motion, one instinctive burst of flight, undid him. Moments later, he was tackled and dragged down, struggling in the dirt. The scholar, the murderer, the genius who had once commanded lecture halls and prison classrooms alike, was reduced to a panting, mud-streaked fugitive. When they searched him, they found false documents, strange notes in multiple languages, and a single blood-stained glove. He gave his name as Charles Augustus, then George Williams, switching identities like masks. But his past finally caught up to him in the form of a single voice. Judge Ransom Balcom, a man who had followed his case for decades, stood over him and said, "You are Edward Howard Rulloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing, and now you've killed again." For once, Edward had no answer. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of his arrest, the name Edward Howard Rulloff once again filled newspaper columns across New York. The elusive scholar killer, the man who had escaped justice for decades, was in chains. Crowds gathered outside the jailhouse in Binghamton to catch a glimpse of him. To some, he looked smaller than expected, almost ordinary. To others, he was precisely what they imagined. A dark intellect trapped inside a human shell. A creature both brilliant and damned. When they brought him into the interrogation room, he sat perfectly still, his eyes calm and assessing. He was soaked from the river, his clothes stained with mud, yet he carried himself as though he were attending a university lecture rather than facing a murder charge. The sheriff read out the accusations, and Rulloff listened in silence. Then, in a voice smooth and unshaken, he asked for a pen and paper to take notes on the proceedings. The arrogance was astonishing. Even cornered, he believed himself the most intelligent man in the room. The evidence against him was devastating. A left shoe found at the crime scene matched the one missing from his foot. Inside it were pieces of cloth, padding for a missing toe he'd lost years earlier to frostbite. It was as unique as a fingerprint. The clerks who survived identified him. When the bodies of his partners, Jarvis and Dexter, were pulled from the Chenango River, papers found on them led police directly to his Brooklyn apartment. There, investigators uncovered the full double life he'd built. Stolen goods, maps, aliases, and the manuscript he'd guarded like a holy relic. It was all there, proof of a lifetime spent dancing between intellect and madness. When Judge Balcom confronted him in person, the moment became legend. The judge's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "You are Edward Howard Rulloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing 25 years ago, and you have murdered again." The words echoed through the room like a sentence passed not just on the man, but on the myth he'd built. Even then, Rulloff's composure did not break. His eyes narrowed slightly, his lips forming the faintest smirk, as if to say that names, accusations, and even time itself were beneath him. The trial began on January 4th, 1871, in a courthouse so crowded that the air turned thick with heat and breath. 2,000 people tried to squeeze into a room built for half that number. Reporters from across the nation descended on Binghamton. They wanted to witness the spectacle of America's genius killer, the scholar who turned murder into an experiment. Every seat was filled. Women fainted in the aisles. Vendors outside sold photographs of the accused as souvenirs. Inside, the man at the center of it all sat perfectly composed. Dressed neatly, his dark hair brushed, his eyes alert and disdainful. He was, as one journalist wrote, a man who spoke as though his intellect had never known fear. He refused a defense attorney. He didn't trust anyone to speak for him. He believed that his brilliance, his command of logic, and his knowledge of law could dismantle the prosecution. In his mind, the courtroom was not a place of judgment. It was a stage, and he the star performer. When the trial opened, The prosecutor laid out the story of the burglary gone wrong, the murder of young Frederick Merrick, and the long trail of deception leading back to Lansing. The physical evidence spoke louder than any rhetoric. The shoe, the witnesses, the letters, the alias, it was a net woven tight around him. Still, Rulloff rose to speak and the crowd fell silent. He spoke without notes, his voice measured and hypnotic. He dissected the prosecution's statements with surgical precision, quoting case law from memory. He reminded the jury that no one had seen him pull the trigger. He questioned the reliability of witnesses, argued that the deaths of his accomplices had been tragic accidents, and portrayed himself as a victim of coincidence and prejudice. His eloquence was dazzling. Even the prosecution admitted privately that he could have been a formidable attorney had he chosen a different life. But brilliance could not erase blood. The prosecutor's rebuttal was merciless. He recounted the murder of Harriet and Priscilla, the years of evasion, the manipulation of friends and students, the false identities. He painted Rulloff not as a misunderstood genius, but as a man who believed his intellect placed him above morality. "This is not a scholar," he told the jury, "but a mind diseased by vanity. A man who murdered because he believed himself too important to face consequence." The verdict came swiftly, guilty of first-degree murder. When the words were read, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Rulloff did not flinch. His expression remained calm, even curious, as though observing the reactions of others in some private psychological study. Only his eyes betrayed the fate. Even condemned, he continued to manipulate. He wrote letters to journalists, scholars, and reformers, arguing that his execution would be a crime against knowledge itself. He claimed that his unfinished work on language held insights that would transform human understanding, and that killing him would be like burning the Library of Alexandria. He described himself not as a criminal, but as a martyr to science. And astonishingly, people listened. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, took up his cause. He argued that such an extraordinary intellect should not be wasted on the gallows. "There is a man in Binghamton," he wrote, "whose brain is too curious an intellectual problem to be destroyed by rope." Letters poured in from reformers and academics alike, some calling for clemency, others for study before death. They wanted to examine his mind, to understand how genius could coexist with savagery. Even Mark Twain, never one to resist dark irony, weighed in, mocking the campaign by offering to donate a lesser criminal for execution in Rulloff's place, so that the great man's brain might be spared for science. His satire cut through the hysteria, exposing the absurdity of worshipping intellect without morality. Yet it also captured the fascination the public felt. For the first time in American history, a killer was being discussed not as a monster, but as an intellectual curiosity. While petitions circulated, Rulloff sat in his cell writing. He filled page after page with reflections on language, philosophy, and fate. He wrote as though he were already immortal, addressing a future audience of scholars who would one day vindicate him. To guards, he was polite and articulate. To visiting reporters, he was mesmerizing. He never begged for mercy. He demanded recognition. When the governor refused to grant a stay of execution, Rulloff's calm finally began to crack. He spent his last weeks alternating between arrogant proclamations and sudden, silent fits of despair. At times, he spoke as though the trial was still underway, presenting imaginary arguments, pacing the cell, whispering to himself in Latin. He also began to write his confession, but, true to form, even that was half performance, half truth. He admitted to killing Harriet, describing the moment in chilling detail, the flash of anger, the blow of the pestle, the spreading blood. But when it came to Priscilla, he deflected responsibility. He claimed he had only given her a sedative to stop her crying. The denial was almost childlike, as if he couldn't bear the thought that he had murdered his own blood. As the day of execution drew near, the fascination surrounding him only deepened. Reporters described him as serene, almost luminous. Some swore his eyes seemed to shine with unearthly clarity. Perhaps it was only the reflection of the lanterns in his cell. But the image stuck. The killer as philosopher. The condemned man who gazed at death with the detachment of a scientist. The morning of May 18, 1871, dawned clear and bright, too beautiful for the occasion. Thousands gathered in Binghamton, some traveling for days just to witness it. Vendors sold food and drinks, children climbed trees for a better view, and families picnicked on nearby hillsides. The crowd's excitement had the feverish energy of a carnival. It was the last public hanging New York would ever allow, and the spectators wanted a show. When Rulloff was led out, he walked without assistance, head held high, lips curved in a faint smile. He wore a clean white shirt and dark coat, his hair neatly brushed. He looked less like a prisoner than a professor heading to deliver a lecture. As he mounted the gallows, the crowd fell silent. One witness described the moment with chilling clarity. He looked upon the scaffold as if it were merely another platform upon which to demonstrate his mastery. The executioner asked if he had any last words. Accounts differ on what he said. Some claimed he whispered, "Hurry it up, I want to be in hell in time for dinner." Others swore his final words were simply, "I can't stand still." Whatever the truth, the rope tightened, and the body of Edward Howard Rulloff fell through the trapdoor. It was over in seconds, but his story was far from finished. Within hours, his body was transported to Cornell University, where Dr. Burt Wilder, professor of neurology and anatomy, awaited with a team of assistants. The brain was removed carefully, measured, weighed and preserved in a glass jar filled with formaldehyde. It was enormous, 1,673 cubic centimeters, the second largest criminal brain on record. Wilder's notes recorded no deformities, no abnormalities that might explain his cruelty. The organ was flawless, perfect symmetry, high capacity, a cathedral of intelligence built around a hollow altar, and so Rulloff achieved the immortality he'd always sought. Not through scholarship, not through his manuscript, but as an exhibit. His brain still rests today in Cornell's Wilder Brain Collection, floating quietly in its jar, the eyes long gone, but the weight of its history pressing against the glass. Visitors stare at it, some out of curiosity, others out of unease. For within that preserved tissue lies the question that haunted an entire century. How could such brilliance coexist with such darkness? The newspapers called him a monster. The academics called him a mystery. But those who studied him closely saw something far more unsettling. A man who believed that intellect absolved him of empathy, that genius was its own morality. He had turned thought itself into a weapon. Long after the crowd dispersed and the last echo of the gallows faded into memory, his story remained. Teachers used it as a cautionary tale. Criminologists dissected it for patterns. The concept of criminal psychology, then barely emerging, found in him its first American case study. Scientists measured his brain, catalogued his behavior, and searched for meaning in every fold of gray matter. But none could explain the emptiness behind the brilliance. There were no lesions, no tumors, no structural flaws. The evil, it seemed, had been born not of defect but of choice. The crowds left Binghamton that afternoon with an odd silence hanging over them. The thrill that had drawn them there had curdled into unease. Those who had cheered his conviction now felt something colder. It was as if the act of watching his body drop through the gallows had not closed a chapter, but opened a darker one. Even in death, Edward Howard Rulloff refused to rest. The newspapers printed every detail they could find. The weight of his brain, the length of the rope, the words he spoke before the trap opened. Reporters described him as calm to the end, even noble in bearing. Some called him the philosopher of crime. Others, the devil of intellect. For days, his name dominated headlines across the United States, and debates raged in parlors and lecture halls alike. What was he truly? A monster disguised as a genius, or a genius consumed by his own madness? At Cornell University, Dr. Burt Wilder began the grim work of scientific immortality. He placed Rulloff's brain in a glass jar, catalogued its size, weight, and structure, and compared it to hundreds of others in his growing collection. Wilder was fascinated. Here was the mind of a man who could read 10 languages, invent new theories of speech, and still crush his wife's skull with an iron pestle. He dissected it as though the answer to human evil might lie hidden in its folds. What he found unsettled him. There was nothing unusual. No tumors, no scars, no malformed gyri. The brain was perfect, smooth, symmetrical, vast. Wilder wrote in his notes that it was the second largest criminal brain ever recorded, yet he admitted, its enormity cannot explain its crimes. And that became the enduring mystery. How could such an exquisite organ produce such horror? The 19th century, drunk on the promise of science, wanted clear answers. But Rulloff's brain refused to yield them. It sat in its jar, silent, mocking the men who studied it, proof that intellect and morality were strangers sharing the same skull. Over the years, the legend grew. Students whispered that his ghost haunted the laboratory at night, pacing restlessly, whispering in dead languages. Professors, examining his preserved brain, spoke of feeling watched. It became a morbid rite of passage to stand before the jar and imagine the thoughts that once moved within it, the calculations, the charm, the rage. Rulloff had wanted immortality through genius, and he got it. But not as a scholar, not as a thinker. His eternity came as a specimen. In the decades that followed, his story became a cornerstone in the birth of criminal psychology. Scholars began to realize that crime was not simply an act of ignorance or poverty. It could be an act of intellect. The idea was terrifying. For centuries, society had comforted itself with the belief that wickedness was the domain of the stupid and the unrefined. Rulloff shattered that illusion. He was proof that evil could wear fine clothes, speak perfect Latin, and lecture on philosophy while planning murder. His case forced thinkers to separate intelligence from empathy. Modern psychiatrists would later study his life as an early example of psychopathy, a personality devoid of guilt, empathy, or remorse, but rich in manipulation, intelligence, and ego. Every description of him matched what the field would later define: charm, deceit, arrogance, and a chilling calm in the face of suffering. In the pages of his letters, the traits were all there. The justification, the self-worship, the coldness masquerading as reason. He never expressed regret. Not for Harriet, not for Priscilla, not for the young clerk who died in that store. To him they were consequences, not victims. He believed the universe owed him indulgence because of his mind. That belief, more than any disease or passion, was his true crime. And perhaps that is what still fascinates those who study him. For Edward Rulloff wasn't a beast driven by impulse. He was a man who killed with intellect intact. He didn't lose control, he simply decided that other lives had less value than his ambitions. He thought in terms of logic, and logic alone cannot tell the difference between creation and destruction. In his own writings, that philosophy lurks like poison. He wrote of man's divine ascent through reason, claiming that intellect was the only path to godhood. He dismissed morality as an invention of the weak, a boundary for lesser minds. In his worldview, those who failed to understand him deserved their fates. He never saw his crimes as murder. He saw them as inevitabilities in the life of a man destined for greatness. When psychologists and historians revisit his letters today, what emerges is not just madness, but a terrifying kind of lucidity. He knew exactly what he was. He saw himself as the next stage of human evolution, a man freed from the burden of conscience. His intelligence was both his pride and his ruin, and yet, even monsters crave recognition. In his final letter before execution, he wrote, "I have lived as the embodiment of intellect in a world of moral fools. They will hang me, but they cannot silence what I have written." He believed that his manuscript would outlive the rope, that scholars 100 years later would finally understand his genius. But when his belongings were inventoried, the manuscript was found unfinished. Its final chapters, a chaotic blend of philosophy and delusion, written in 3 languages and filled with half-sentences. It was unreadable. The work that was supposed to make him immortal ended as gibberish, the ramblings of a man who mistook complexity for depth. Yet even in failure, he changed something fundamental. His case reshaped the way America thought about the mind. It forced scholars to ask questions that still haunt modern criminology. Are killers born or made? Can intelligence exist without empathy? Does knowledge elevate the soul, or simply sharpen its capacity for evil? Rulloff's life provided no answers, only warnings. For criminologists, he became a template, the intersection of intellect and amorality. For philosophers, a symbol of reason without heart. For the public, a ghostly echo reminding them that monsters do not always come with snarls and blood-stained hands. Sometimes they come with books and eloquence. Even today, his story lingers in academic halls. In the psychology wing at Cornell, the glass jar remains, a relic from another age, cloudy with time. Students still visit, staring at that silent gray mass and feeling the strange pull of contradiction. They see a man who could have changed the world, who instead chose to dissect it with cruelty. Some say the air around the display feels colder. Others claim that if you stare long enough, you begin to imagine thoughts moving behind the glass, language forming, patterns aligning, as if the mind refuses to accept its own extinction. Perhaps it's only imagination, or perhaps genius once awakened never fully dies. But what survives most clearly is the lesson. Edward Howard Rulloff was proof that intellect without empathy is the most dangerous weapon of all. A gun kills in an instant. A mind like his destroys slowly, deliberately, with reason to justify every act. His intelligence made him persuasive, his charm disarming, his cruelty undetectable until it was too late. He blurred the boundary between wisdom and wickedness until they became the same reflection staring back at him from a mirror. He was not the first man to mistake brilliance for virtue, nor will he be the last. His story lives as a warning to every age that worships intellect without conscience. For every invention, every discovery, every leap forward in understanding, there must be something to anchor it, a heart, a moral weight, a recognition of what should never be done. No matter how clever the method, without that anchor, genius becomes hunger. It devours everything around it, family, love, innocence, even itself. In that sense, Rulloff was a prophet of the modern age, the first to prove that intelligence is not salvation but potential, that knowledge alone does not make men good. His was the prototype of the brilliant sociopath, the manipulator, the killer who believes himself chosen. His descendants would appear in every century to follow, in laboratories, in offices, in systems of power where intellect thrives but compassion dies. And so, more than 150 years later, his name still surfaces, sometimes in lectures, sometimes in dark corners of true crime history. The man who turned reason into ruin, his preserved brain, floating in its glass tomb, remains as silent testimony. It does not speak, yet it whispers an unending question to anyone who dares look upon it. Where does the line between genius and evil truly lie? That question has no answer, and perhaps it never will. But it lingers, like a low hum beneath the noise of progress, reminding us that the greatest horrors are not born from ignorance, but from brilliance unrestrained. And in the flicker of laboratory light, the reflection on that glass jar trembles slightly, as though something inside still listens. Maybe it's only the fluid shifting, or maybe somewhere in that perfect brain, the last echo of Edward Rulloff's thought continues to murmur.